welcome to the channel. This is Nerd.World History, and in today's video we are examining the very first ever tank engagement in the known history of armoured warfare. And I'm not just talking about the Battle of the Somme, which is where it's mostly famous for, although it is part of the Battle of the Somme, but I mean the specific, exact first battle that a tank ever participated in any form in hostile warfare. Before we get started, if you like this channel and any videos on it, including this one, please like, share, subscribe, comment down below. Please check out my other two channels that are linked in the description below. They're not exactly similar to this one, they're much more sci-fi and fiction based. That's Nerd.World Films and Nerd.World. Please check them out, like, share, subscribe over there if you like them, and if you really want to, click the bell icon. With all that said, let's get started on the Battle of the Somme and the very first introduction of the tank, the Mark I British tank specifically. Bit of context, brief background on the tank itself. The idea of mobile armoured warfare been around for a long time. The days of Hannibal, you've got elephants with troops on them, carrying little citadels around. Various different times in history you had armoured chariots, you had armoured wagons of different descriptions, armour on horses, knights in shining armour in general. You had various types of pillboxes and things. Basically, armoured warfare, the concept of armoured warfare and mobile armoured warfare have been around in one form or another for a very long time. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, sketched the idea of what could be considered to be the very first ever tank, although it wasn't a very good design, and I know a practical model of it was actually built and it's not very good, but the idea was there. Jump forward to the early 20th century, and the idea was knocking around in the pre-war era. There was one notable Austrian engineer who actually came up with a basic design which you would have easily called a tank in the pre-war era, which included a turret, tracks, a suspension system and a drivetrain that would have basically made it a tank. But the Austrian Empire wouldn't go for the design because it was too expensive, too radical, and they weren't currently engaged in a war which required it. So the idea was thrown out. Many different countries, including Britain, Germany, the United States as well, even at that time, although not so much with the Americans, but a little bit, they were all thinking about it. Everyone was thinking about this idea. How do you get your troops around effectively without them all getting killed? Then, 1914, the First World War breaks out, and then you get the Western Front. Stalemate. How do you break it? And it took Winston Churchill and others to come up with a landship idea to develop a sort of land battleship that could simply drive across the trenches without anyone being able to stop it, just like a naval gunboat would be able to do just on land. So they created the tanks, which incidentally was a cover word to deceive German spies into believing it was just water carriers, not actually armoured vehicles. The name just kind of stuck. They were ready by 1916 and came in two stock types, the male and the female in the original form. The female was armed only with machine guns, Vickers machine guns, specifically water-cooled, very effective weapon, very, very powerful. And the male also had machine guns, but also included two 6-pounder naval guns, basically small ship cannons. Very effective weapons. Now, again, stretch forward to the Battle of the Somme, 1916, when Haig decided, after his disastrous offensive was already underway, that they would roll out the new weapons, and they had 49 tanks for the Battle of the Somme initially. 3 of them will be deployed on the night, or rather the morning, of the 15th of September 1916. 3 tanks from the British D Company were deployed to a small section of woods to the flank of the British offensive called Deville Woods. These tanks' purpose, and combined with infantry, was to clear out the Germans from in those woods. Something they would ultimately be successful in doing. The tanks would roll in at first, very slow moving, the early tanks, only about 4 or 5 miles per hour if you were lucky. The first tank suffered mechanical problems and broke down. The second tank got stuck in the very, very shelled ground. Bear in mind, Deville Woods in 1916 was shelled, bombed and burned extensively. Trees were splintered, the ground was potholed. It wasn't a wood anymore, it was more like a hellscape. In fact, soldiers referred to it actually as the Devil's Woods. The third tank was nicknamed Deville by its commanding officer Harold Mortimer. This would be the very first tank ever in the world to fire a shot in anger at any target of any kind during wartime conditions. It would be opened fire upon initially by the Germans, who would attack it first. It would then return fire with machine guns as well as its 6-pounder cannons going along the side of the trench and attacking them, but eventually would take a major hit itself, which will blow off its track, making that tank out of commission. Although this was a relatively ignominious start to the career of such a successful battle vehicle into the modern age. I don't just mean the Mark 1s, Mark 2s and etc. from the First World War, I mean tanks in general, all the way up to the modern Abrams tank. It almost looked like a bad start. One broke down, one got stuck, this all-terrain vehicle got stuck, for God's sakes. And the other one was taken out pretty early in the fight. But the battle was successful and they drove the Germans out of the woods. This was the first ever engagement of tanks in battle of any description. Now, of course, this was part of the wider Battle of the Somme, but this was the day before their major massed offensive, where they would start to roll across the trenches, which was what they were actually designed to do. These tanks hadn't been sent into trenches, they'd been sent into woods. And although realistically for the first outing of any armoured vehicle they actually performed relatively well and did inflict some damage, particularly psychological damage on the Germans, but they did actually manage to kill several of the enemy combatants. 2 of them were rendered inoperable before the battle even began. It would be a repeat story during the actual battle, many of the tanks falling victim to mechanical failure, but that was teething problems with these early vehicles that were sent into battle really before they were ready. As I said, that was the first ever battle conducted by tanks of any description in wartime conditions. I hope you find it interesting. I read about it recently and thought it was an interesting side note to the tank. Whenever you read about the Battle of the Somme being the first deployment of tanks, that's all well and good, and you learn about maybe the major offensive, some umbrella organs, what it was called, etc. But this was to me, much more personal. It was only 3 tanks, not a whole division, just a part of a division, just part of D Company, just a few tanks sent out to try and clear out some woods. The kind of jobs that tanks are meant to do when they're not fighting other tanks. Because basically, really think about it, sometimes a tank only seems like it exists to fight other tanks, but that's not why it exists. It's got the capability to engage and destroy other tanks, but only because those tanks are trying to get past your lines so they can use their high explosives, flamethrowers, machine guns, whatever weapons are now being equipped with in the more modern age, to wipe out your infantry, destroy your bunkers, blow up your bridges, blow up your villages. That's what they're actually there for, and this effectively, because no one had a tank to counter it, was basically what the tank was really designed to do, wipe out enemy forces. And the one tank that actually reached the battle did it okay. Right, with that said, again, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something, because I did when I was researching it. Please like, share, subscribe, comment down below, and bye-bye.